Queens, New York. A dreary December afternoon. Buses whooshed by, leaving behind thin streaks of smoke and the cold, screeching wail of worn-out brakes. On the sidewalk outside an old subway station, a man huddled between two tightly tied black plastic sacks. In the bittersweet chill of winter, he was nearly invisible, just another figure among the busy, indifferent crowds. Raymond Ellis, 62, once served in the 8th Combat Logistics Unit in Fallujah, Iraq. But here he was, merely that silent old man with the torn backpack, as the neighborhood teenagers called him, while tossing empty snack wrappers at him after school. His olive-green military-issued backpack, frayed to the point of breaking, no longer held ammunition or supplies. Now it carried things no one wanted to touch: crushed plastic bottles, scrap paper stuffed into his shoes, a nearly empty bottle of cough syrup, and one weathered photograph wrapped in 3 layers of plastic. It was Linda, his wife, on their wedding day. Soft curls, a tilted smile. Raymond gently pulled the photo from the inside pocket of his coat. His eyes softened. He whispered, perhaps only to himself, "I'm still here, Lynn. Every day I'm trying to survive for you." People passed as if he didn't exist. A young woman sipping latte and lost in her podcast veered sideways just in time to avoid tripping over his bags. Not a single glance. Raymond didn't beg. He didn't hold a sign. He didn't complain. He existed but didn't live, as if his presence was the final test of patience for a world too busy to stop spinning. "I used to be useful. Now I'm just a burden." He had once murmured that to a volunteer at the soup station near Flushing. Each day blurred into the last, a smudged copy of the one. Before he collected bottles, turned them in at a tiny recycling depot near the Asian market, and received a few coins, barely enough to buy some expectorant medicine, the only thing he relied on to keep his lungs from freezing during sub-zero nights. Deep within Raymond's fractured mind, the war had never ended. The night sounds, car alarms, fireworks from the park, sometimes jolted him awake, sweat-soaked, gasping, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. Linda used to say, "Memory is something we can't throw away, but we can learn to live with it." But Linda was gone too soon. Pancreatic cancer misdiagnosed as indigestion at the VA hospital. By the time the correct results came back, they came with a death sentence. After the funeral, Raymond never went home. He sold their modest Bronx apartment and wired every cent to Hope for Kids, the charity Linda once supported with quiet passion. Then he disappeared from the system. No new address, no letters were received, no calls were made. Sometimes being no one hurts less than living with the memory of being the man who couldn't save the one he loved. A fateful afternoon approaches. That afternoon, something felt different. The hunger wasn't just gnawing, it was unbearable. His stomach twisted in sharp spasms, a violent reminder that he hadn't eaten in 3 days, save for a few cough drops. Tiny snowflakes had begun to fall. A few white specks landed on the shoulders of his coarse canvas coat, dissolving the moment they touched the damp fabric. Across the street, warm yellow light spilled from the window of D'Angelo's grocery, reflecting on the wet asphalt. Behind the glass, a long baguette sat drying near the corner display labeled "End-of-Day Discount." Raymond stood. His hands trembled slightly. No one noticed when he stepped inside. He knew he shouldn't, but the cold, the hunger, the fading memory of Linda, all of it pulled him forward like a ghostly voice whispering him into a mistake. Just seconds later, "Hey, stop right there!" The voice of Mr. D'Angelo boomed from behind the counter. Raymond turned, the loaf still hidden inside his coat, barely gripped in his shaking hand. I just needed the strength to live one more day," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The morning after. Before the sun could rise, cold white fluorescent lights already flooded the corridors of Queens County Courthouse. Raymond Ellis, 62, was led into the courtroom, wearing the same clothes from the day before, a heavy canvas coat, worn thin sleeve cuffs torn, and a knit beanie no longer shielding him from the bitter wind. Around his neck hung a dull silver chain with a faded military ID tag. No one paid attention. He walked slowly, eyes down left foot, dragging slightly a wound from Iraq that never fully healed. The cold bite of the handcuffs pressed into his bony wrists. The 2 officers flanking him said nothing. One, a younger cop, seemed uneasy as he glanced at Raymond's weary face. "You were in the service?" the young officer asked quietly, eyes fixed on the worn tag. Raymond simply nodded. I used to be somebody. Not anymore. The air in the courtroom felt thick-clotted with the kind of familiar apathy that comes from a society too used to watching people fall. An invisible sentence. That morning's docket wasn't crowded. A few reporters were present covering more high-profile cases. Some young attorneys scrolled on their phones, barely glancing at the frail man seated quietly at the defendant's table, his head bowed. Raymond had no one with him, no friends, no family. No one stood to vouch that he had once been a good man. No one testified that he had once saved lives. Just a petty theft report and a name Ellis Raymond assigned to case. No 38772. Next up, the state of New York versus Raymond Ellis. The clerk's voice was flat and different. Judge Henry Alcott. 51 emerged from the side door clad in a black robe. He was known for his unyielding style, nicknamed the law's iron grip for his no-nonsense rulings. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file. A young prosecutor stood. His suit collar is slightly askew. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was caught attempting to steal a loaf of bread from D'Angelo's grocery. Given his prior record and lack of stable residence, we request that he be held until formal trial. The first glance, Judge Alcott hadn't yet looked up. His hand turned the page of the case file, same as always, until he saw the name. Raymond Edward Ellis. A pause barely noticeable, but if one watched closely, his left hand tensed, clutching the edge of the desk. A silent current ran through his eyes, transitioning from detached to vacant. His face slackened. Then he slowly looked up and met the defendant's eyes. Two pairs of eyes, 20 years apart. Raymond still had his head bowed, until by chance his gaze met the judge's. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Both men fell still as if time itself had frozen. At that moment, no judgment passed, only a long-buried memory awakened. You once. But Alcott didn't finish the sentence. He closed the case file, then stood. The courtroom gasped. A judge never stood during a hearing. But here he was, standing hand pressed against the desk, face tense. Not a word. No one dared breathe. A silence that shook the room. Court is recessed for 15 minutes. The judge's voice wavered for the first time that day. No one understood what had just happened. Attorneys whispered. Reporters scribbled. The prosecutor fumbled through his file, looking for some missed detail. Only Raymond remained still, expression unchanged. He didn't know why the court had stopped, didn't understand what had struck the judge so deeply at the sight of his name. But in that moment, he felt something. For the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen him. The judge's chambers were still. No sound of gavels, no stern voices, only one man standing alone under the pale fluorescent light, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't for years. Judge Henry Alcott leaned against the edge of his old wooden desk. For a long while he did nothing. He simply breathed long, heavy breaths, as if trying to hold back something rising from the deep trenches of memory. Then slowly he opened a drawer. He knew exactly what he was looking for. A photograph never forgotten. Inside a weathered brown envelope marked personal lay a faded color photograph. He pulled it out carefully, his fingers slightly trembling. It was a photo of a group of American soldiers in desert uniforms, standing outside a field tent in Fallujah, Iraq in 2004. One of them was him, only 30 years old at the time. A combat medic, his nervous smile barely visible beneath the edge of his helmet. But the man who drew the eye stood in the back row, tall, composed eyes steely, yet calm. Raymond Ellis, then a staff sergeant in logistics, a man known across the unit for his cold courage and unwavering strength. It was that man who had carried Henry out of hellfire 20 years ago. The memory came flooding back. Henry stared at the photograph. Then came the rush, smoke dense and black gunfire piercing. A burning supply truck, its steel frame twisted like paper, blood streaming down his leg, pooling in the sand, and that voice clear and commanding, cutting through the chaos. Keep breathing, Alcott. Don't pass out. I'll get you out. Raymond had carried him 2 miles under live fire, even with shrapnel in his thigh. Confirming the truth, Judge Alcott sat down. His eyes stayed fixed on the image. He opened his laptop and logged into the Federal Veterans Database. He still had access through his past work in legal aid for discharged soldiers. He typed, Name Raymond Edward Ellis. Military ID, 80773L. Rank Staff. Sergeant Service, 1982-2004. Deployments: Gulf War, Iraq. Twice, Afghanistan. Decorations: Bronze Star for valor in combat zones. Special note: credited with rescuing 17 soldiers during a 2004 ambush in Fallujah. An attached photo loaded. Raymond, his face streaked with ash, was holding a wounded Afghan child, sprinting toward a medevac helicopter. That photo had once been on the front page of the New York Times in 2004. But like many war heroes, he vanished from headlines once the war was over. A discovery that stung the heart. Another file popped up, Top Secret Declassified, 2022. One line stood out. Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis, despite personal injury, carried medic Henry Alcott out of enemy fire over 2.1 miles. His actions exceeded duty expectations and were documented in emergency field reports. Henry read it again and again as if afraid it would vanish. His eyes reddened, his chest tightened. Then finally he whispered, "God, it's him. He's the one who saved my life." Rage under the surface. He clicked further onto Raymond's benefits history. What he saw made his blood freeze. Raymond's benefits had been cut off in 2008 after failing to respond to a single address confirmation letter. No one followed up. No one checked why a decorated war hero had vanished. And just like that, he slipped through the cracks. We let him become homeless, after saving 17 people, after saving me. Henry's hands clenched, his chest burned not from war memories, but from shame. The shame of a society that let its heroes fall silently. Preparing for a reckoning, Sparfs. Alcott picked up the phone. "Colonel Samuel Brooks. This is Judge Henry Alcott. I found him, Raymond Ellis. He's here in my courtroom." There was silence on the other end. "Then keep him there. I'm on my way." 3 hours later, a dark gray military SUV roared down a foggy expressway, racing from Fort Hamilton to Queens. Inside sat Colonel Samuel Brooks, Raymond's former logistics commander, gripping a dossier tightly in his lap. His eyes stayed locked on the phone screen that displayed Raymond Ellis, detained, Queens County Courthouse. "He's alive," Brooks whispered. "After all these years, he's alive, and we left him out there alone." Inside the holding cell, Raymond sat against the cold concrete wall. No clock, no natural light. Only the soft howl of the wind through the ventilation and the rhythmic click of the locking mechanism during guard rotations. He didn't ask the time, didn't ask when he would be released. Didn't count the days. Time had long since lost its meaning for him. In his hand, wrapped in plastic, was the photograph of Linda, the one he had preserved for over 15 years. "You always told me not to punish myself for too long." His whisper barely escaped his cracked lips. "But how do I forgive myself? When I let you die alone? For a system I once believed in." A young officer walked past, pausing to glance in quietly. He'd seen a leaked blog post. Something about a judge pausing a theft trial for a homeless veteran. He didn't understand, didn't care. Just another old man with a blank stare and eyes too tired to argue with the world. The truth begins to leak. Later that afternoon, a headline appeared on a local blog. "Veteran claims to have served in Iraq, arrested for stealing bread. Judge halts trial for unknown reasons." A blurry photo of Raymond taken from behind was attached. And with that, the undercurrent began to stir. Social media exploded with a mix of skepticism and outrage. Another faker using the veteran card for sympathy. If he's a soldier, why isn't he getting VA benefits instead of stealing food? Why did the judge stand up for a nobody? But also, if he really was a hero once and we left him behind, we owe him more than apologies. Not all medals shine. Some are buried under layers of silence. Inside the courthouse, the judge takes action. Judge Henry Alcott didn't read the comments. He was too busy making calls. From his private phone, he dialed the National Veterans Center. "I need a full records confirmation on Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis. ID number 80773L, reason legal and ethical urgency." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "We'll prioritize it immediately, sir." Within minutes, an email landed in the judge's inbox. It contained Raymond's full service record, his awards injury documentation, and most damning, a system error log that explained how his benefits had been accidentally terminated in 2008. Alcott printed it with shaking hands. At the bottom of one document it read, "Total unpaid benefits owed USD 2 Farmeist 812. The final call of the day. Judge Alcott picked up the phone again. His fingers trembled slightly. A familiar voice answered. "This is Colonel James Mason. Mason, it's Alcott. I need you to testify. It's about Raymond Ellis. Do you remember him?" "Remember him? I'm already driving there. 3 hours out. I'll be there by morning. Don't let him leave." Alcott hung up slowly. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were filled with remorse, a long unpaid debt, and the first real chance to make it right. A face from the past, source, embalmed. Returns. Meanwhile, across Queens, a young woman sat in a small apartment reading the news on her phone. The blurry photo of the homeless man struck her like lightning. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, Uncle Ray," she whispered. "I've been looking for you for years." Her name was Melanie. She was Linda's niece, Raymond's only remaining family, and she had just found the man the world had all but buried. The next morning, the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 6A creaked open, not for a routine hearing, but for something far more rare. Every seat was filled. Journalists from local networks, veterans in uniform, pro bono, attorneys, law students, even neighbors from the streets where Raymond once drifted unseen, all of them had come. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, only that something important, something human was unfolding. This time, Raymond was not alone. He stepped into the courtroom, still in the same threadbare canvas coat, but this time his wrists were free, and waiting at the defense table was not some half-interested public defender. It was a gray-haired man in a crisp suit, eyes clear and firm, Attorney Richard Harlow, senior counsel at the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. "Someone has taken notice of your case," Mr. Ellis Harlow said, gently as Raymond sat beside him. His tone was respectful, measured almost reverent. "Today is your day to be heard." The doors open, and history walks. In all eyes turned as 3 uniformed officers entered the courtroom in full ceremonial dress. They followed the court-martials, said nothing, but their presence carried the weight of a buried chapter in military history. Then came another man. Colonel James Mason was still sharp in posture, despite his years. As he walked down the aisle, his steps seemed to leave echoes in the wood-paneled room. He carried with him no weapon, just the truth. "Judge Alcott returns. Judge Henry." Alcott stepped in. The entire courtroom rose, but Raymond didn't look up at him like a man facing judgment. He looked straight into the judge's eyes, and in that gaze was something deeper than recognition. 2 old soldiers seeing one another again, not on a battlefield, but in a battlefield of memory. Alcott sat, lifted his gavel, knocked once. Before continuing the matter of the state versus Raymond Ellis, this court will hear the testimony of a special witness, whose account may alter the nature of this case entirely. A brother-in-arms takes the stand. Colonel James Mason stood. He didn't look at the press, didn't look at the onlookers. He looked at Raymond, then turned to the judge. "I am Colonel James Mason, currently serving at Fort Hamilton. I knew Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis during Operation Iraqi Freedom 2004. I was commanding the 3rd Logistics Battalion." He paused. The room held its breath. "On May 17, 2004, our convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. A fuel truck exploded. Gunfire rained from 3 sides. The only man who ran into that fire was Sergeant Ellis. He drove a burning truck out of the kill zone, saving 17 soldiers, including me. Then, despite a wound to his leg, he carried a young medic nearly 2 miles under enemy fire. That medic is now seated before you as Judge Henry Alcott." Silence, heavy as stone. A slow, stunned hush spread through the room. All eyes turned toward the bench. For the first time, the stoic, famously unemotional Judge Alcott nodded, once deliberately and with raw emotion in his eyes. There were no gasps, no laughter. No one dared interrupt the silence with anything but reverence. Raymond did not speak. He sat still, expression unchanged. But behind his calm was a storm of disbelief, pain, and something else, a flicker of dignity. The system's failure, laid bare. Colonel Mason continued. "After we returned, Raymond applied for early retirement due to combat wounds and PTSD. His wife Linda died after a misdiagnosis at the VA hospital. He withdrew from the World Refused Assistance, and due to a system error, his benefits were cut off in 2008. Mason held up the file. To this day, he has lost over $246,000 in owed payments and health care access, all because of one undelivered letter. Attorney Harlow speaks. Harlow rose from the defense table. Your Honor, he said, Raymond Ellis is not a thief. He is a symbol of courage, of duty, of loyalty. Betrayed by the very system he once bled for. He does not need pity. He deserves restoration. A judge's voice. No longer a hammer. Judge. Alcott removed his glasses. He looked at Raymond. Raymond, I spent nearly 20 years trying to find the man who carried me out of hell. Only knowing a last name, Ellis shouted between explosions. I never forgot what you said to me when my blood ran through the sand. Keep breathing, kid. Your story's not over. Today I give that story back to you. The part we never got to finish. No one moved, not a pen scratched, not a shutter clicked. The entire courtroom was suspended in a silence so deep, it sounded like an apology, one that had waited far too long to be spoken. Raymond Ellis still sat at the defendant's table, but now he was not alone. To his left, Attorney Richard Harlow, defending him not out of obligation, but out of moral duty. Behind him, decorated military officers, brothers in arms, and a colonel who owed his life to him. They were not there as an audience. They were there as witnesses to justice long delayed. A judge offers the floor. Judge Alcott set down his pen and looked directly at Raymond. Mr. Ellis, he said, do you wish to speak before the court? You are welcome to. We are here to listen. Raymond did not stand right away. He reached to straighten his collar, took a slow breath not to impress, but to steady a tide rising in his throat. Then in a voice as rough as gravel yet clear as memory, he spoke. I am not a hero. I was a soldier doing my job. I did it for those beside me. I did it for the woman I promised I'd come home to. I don't hate society. I don't blame anyone. I just think, maybe it's time we look again, because sometimes the people we think are worthless are the ones who once stood between death and someone else's life. He didn't raise his voice, but no voice had ever carried louder in that room. The moment of judgment, completely reversed. The young prosecutor, the same man who had requested that Raymond be detained for theft and lack of a permanent address, stood up. His hand trembled slightly on the file folder, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, in light of extraordinary circumstances, heroic military history confirmed administrative failure and prolonged psychological impact due to combat trauma. The people hereby withdraw all charges against Mr. Raymond Ellis with our deepest apologies. A sigh rippled somewhere in the back rows. It was not exhaustion, it was a relief. The verdict, Judge. Alcott nodded once he raised the gavel. This court declares all charges against Mr. Raymond Ellis are hereby dismissed. Further, this court recommends the Department of Veterans Affairs and local agencies immediately restore all benefits, rights, and honors due to Mr. Ellis, and issues a public apology not only in the name of the law, but as a citizen, as someone who owes this man his life. Gavel silence history. In the hall, the story spreads. The courtroom doors swung open. Raymond walked out not as a defendant, but as a man who had been seen, heard, and finally vindicated. Sunlight hit his face, and for the first time it wasn't just weather, it was resurrection. Reporters pushed in, but he said nothing. He was too focused on one familiar face in the crowd. Family returns, and so does Grace Uncle Ray. A voice rang out, cracked with emotion. Raymond turned. A young woman with soft curls and eyes just like Linda's pushed through the crowd. She was crying, but smiling. It's me, Melanie, Linda's niece. I've been looking for you for 10 years. You vanished. No one knew where you'd gone. I thought I'd never see you again. Raymond fell into her arms. For the first time in 15 years, someone touched him, not as a threat or pity, but as a family. I'm sorry, he whispered. I thought I didn't deserve to come back. She held his hand tight. No, you're the one who deserves it the most. That night, news anchors changed their headlines. Not a criminal, but a hero. The courtroom case that made a nation. Reflect. From a loaf of bread to a landmark ruling, when justice stopped to listen. And on social media, millions shared a single photo. Raymond Ellis walking out of court, flanked by Colonel Mason, Judge Alcott, and Melanie. Beneath it is a single caption. Not everyone in rags is lost. Some are just carrying wars you'll never see. No bands were waiting, no rows of flags, no grand speeches echo across a marble plaza. But Raymond Ellis came home anyway. Melanie's apartment, a place with light. That evening, Melanie brought Raymond to the small apartment in Astoria she shared with her husband. They cleared out the living room and made up a bed near the window. "It's not a big place," she said with a soft laugh, "but it's a home, and someone here is waiting for you." Raymond didn't speak. He simply nodded, eyes misting, not from memory but from the unfamiliar warmth of being welcomed. At the dinner table, a candle and a photograph. That night he sat quietly at the modest dinner table. A single candle flickered over aged wood. On the wall, a photograph of Melanie's wedding, and another, a much older one, of a young girl smiling beside Linda decades ago. Raymond reached out gently, touched the corner of Linda's picture with 2 fingers. "I'm sorry I took so long, Lynn, but I finally made it home." Restoration cannot be measured in dollars. 2 days later, at the Veterans Affairs Office, Raymond was formally awarded his full compensation, over $246,000 in unpaid benefits. Additional reparations for the wrongful termination of medical and housing assistance. When the caseworker placed the check on the desk, Raymond stared at it for a long, long time. Then he said, "I don't need it all for myself. Use some of it for others like me who are still out there in the dark." Attorney Harlow, standing beside him, smiled. "Mr. Ellis, you didn't just reclaim justice for yourself. You're opening the door for thousands of others. A forgotten generation." Now remembered, the courtroom story went viral. Within days, a group of legal and mental health professionals established the Ellis Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal aid, mental health services, and emergency housing to homeless veterans. 1 week later at the launch event, Raymond stood on a small podium. His vest was crisp, his shirt white, and his military pin polished. "I once believed no one remembered me," he said softly. "But sometimes, all it takes is one person remembering for someone like me to start standing again. And if I can still walk, I'll keep walking forward so no one else has to feel the kind of silence I once called home." A statue of remembrance. 3 months later, outside the Queens County Courthouse, a statue was unveiled. It showed Raymond, shoulders squared, carrying a wounded soldier through rising smoke. The face of the wounded soldier. A young Judge Alcott. Below it is a single engraved sentence. "Justice is not judgment. It is remembering the one who stood between life and death so that others could go on living." A quiet moment. That meant everything. One late afternoon, Raymond sat alone on a bench in Prospect Park, the same park he had once slept in during bitter winters. The spring breeze played softly through his now neatly trimmed hair. His clothes were simple, clean. His presence is no longer invisible. A boy around 10 sat beside him, sketchpad in hand. "Are you Mr. Raymond?" the boy asked. "I drew you for school. I called it, 'Not everyone in rags is bad.' A's, dasiu stad." And Raymond looked down at the drawing. Then he smiled a real smile, one not forced or hidden, but earned. It was a bright summer afternoon at Jefferson High School in Brooklyn. Laughter echoed through the courtyard. Students raced across the basketball court. The air smelled faintly of hot asphalt and pencil shavings. But inside room 214, the atmosphere was still charged not with silence, but with listening. 30 high schoolers sat in near awe as Raymond Ellis stood before them. Not in uniform, not with medals, just a plain shirt, steady eyes, and a story that had finally found its audience. On the board, a photo, forgotten then found. Taped to the whiteboard was a faded image from the New York Times 2004 Raymond in desert gear, carrying a wounded Afghan child through black smoke. The caption beneath read, "Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis," once on the front page, then forgotten. Raymond looked at the photo. Then he turned to the class. "I used to think that falling meant staying silent. But I've learned if we all stay silent, others will fall too, and no one will even know they were ever standing." A question from a student. A boy in the 3rd row raised his hand. "Sir, do you ever regret saving people? I mean, if you hadn't, maybe you wouldn't have ended up suffering after the war." Raymond paused, then smiled. Not bitter, not broken. "I regret disappearing, but I've never regretted carrying someone to safety. Not once. Even when I was down to my last breath, I told myself, just breathe. Their story isn't over yet. A story is yours, it was kind." From speaker to messenger, that speech was the first of many. In the months that followed, Raymond spoke at over 20 schools, 6 veteran support organizations, 3 national legal aid conferences. He never took payment. Instead, he divided his government compensation into 3 impact funds. Mental health fund for veterans suffering from PTSD, Legal Defense Fund for Homeless Veterans, the Linda Ellis Scholarship for Children of Service Members entering healthcare and social work. A reporter once asked him, "Mr. Ellis, do you feel like justice has been served?" Raymond's answer was quiet. Justice isn't something you get back, not fully. You can't be reimbursed for years of silence. But I don't need reimbursement. I just need to make sure the next person doesn't go unseen the way I did. An unexpected reunion. One Sunday evening, Raymond sat down to dinner at the home of Judge Henry Alcott, the very man he once carried on his back through a storm of gunfire. The meal was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie baked by the judge's wife. Halfway through dinner, Henry's 13-year-old son, Daniel, looked up from his plate. "Mr. Raymond, aren't you angry? After everything you had to live like that for years." Raymond placed his fork down, met the boy's gaze, and for a moment, the weight of 2 decades softened in his expression. "No, Daniel, I'm not angry. I'm just a little sad. Sad that sometimes it takes us too long to really see each other. If someone had seen me sooner, maybe I'd have found my way back earlier. A living symbol, not of war but of renewal, one national newspaper called him. The quiet veteran who redefined honor. A popular news show asked him to appear. He declined. "I don't need the whole country to know who I was." He said, "I just want a few people to remember that some heroes never asked to be remembered." A vendor's apology and a gentle response. One evening passing through a nearby outdoor market, Raymond was stopped. A young man approached nervous. "Are you Mr. Ellis? My father was Mr. D'Angelo, the shop owner who called the cops that day. He passed away last year. But before he did, he said one of his biggest regrets was not asking how hungry you were." Raymond nodded. No anger, no resentment. "Your father saw me, the way society trained him to see people like me. But today you saw me differently. That means things are changing." Veterans Day. At Fort Hamilton, where Raymond Ellis had once reported for duty more than 2 decades ago, a formal ceremony was underway. Rows of soldiers, recruits, seasoned officers, and old comrades stood in silent formation. The American flag rose slowly in the crisp autumn breeze. Trumpets didn't play yet, but already the air felt sacred. At the center of the ceremony, standing at the place of honor on the dais, was a name that was no longer forgotten. Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis. For the first time in 20 years, he wore his formal dress uniform, perfectly pressed and adorned with his Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and multiple campaign ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan. Applause that needed no cue. When his name was called, no announcer had to say, "Please stand." No band struck up music. Yet everyone rose, soldiers and civilians, commanders and cadets, children and elderly, and they clapped. Not for victory, not for a medal, but for a man who had returned from the darkest corners of abandonment, still carrying his integrity intact. The speech a nation. Needed Raymond stepped up to the microphone. No teleprompter, no speech cards, just his voice and a lifetime behind it. "There was a time I stood on a very thin line, not in Fallujah, but on cold sidewalks in forgotten corners of this city, where no one looked at me, or if they did, they didn't see me. I used to wear this uniform every day, and when I stopped, I wondered if anyone still cared who I was." He looked out over the crowd. Many were in tears. "But I've learned something. You don't need a parade to come home. You just need one person willing to say, 'I see you,' and that changes everything." A message. Larger than the stage. "I don't want pity, I never did. What I want, what I hope is that no one who served this country ever has to feel forgotten the way I once did. I'm being honored today, but don't let this end here, because there are still people out there, waiting to be seen. Kindness is never too late, you just have to be the one who brings it." And with that, he stepped back. No theatrics, just a man who had once been lost, now standing as a beacon for those still in the shadows. An unscripted salute. As Raymond turned from the podium, a group of young soldiers spontaneously rose and offered him a full military salute. No one had told them to. They didn't do it for the cameras. They did it because they knew. This man didn't just survive, he carried the weight of those who couldn't. Quiet reverence from those who owed him everything. In the front row, Judge Henry Alcott removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. Beside him, Colonel James Mason leaned in and said low, "We may have lost one battlefield, but today, we just won back a human being." The letters that followed. In the week that followed, Raymond received hundreds of letters and emails. A mother from Iowa sent a photo of her son who had served under him. A formerly homeless veteran from Texas wrote, "Because of you, I went back and applied for my benefits again. This time, I didn't give up." A boy in Boston submitted a crayon drawing of Raymond standing next to the American flag with a scribbled note, "You're why I want to grow up to be good." 3 years later, a soft autumn sun spilled through the window of a modest apartment in Veterans Village, a small residential community built for retired service members. The apartment was simple, neat, humble. A mug of warm tea sat on the table. Beside it, a worn paperback, a folded blanket, and a framed photo of Linda placed next to a polished bronze star. On the armchair by the window, Raymond Ellis sat in silence. His hands rested gently on his lap. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his face aged but calm, marked not by sorrow, but by peace. Raymond had finally found where he belonged, a life with meaning, not noise. Each morning, he rose early to walk around the courtyard of Veterans Village, greeting guards, nurses, and younger veterans undergoing PTSD therapy. In the afternoons, he spent time in the small on-site library, not reading, but listening. To voices like his had once been quiet, trembling, unsure if they were worth hearing. "We're not here to fix the past," he often said. "We're here to make sure silence is never again, where pain goes to hide." Melanie, the bridge between generations. Melanie, now a full-time social worker with the Ellis Initiative, visited every week. They shared meals, quiet talks, and sometimes just sat in silence, knowing that silence no longer meant being forgotten. One evening she asked him, "If you could start all over, would you change anything?" Raymond turned to the window, looking out at the row of red brick rooftops glowing in sunset. "I wouldn't need to change it, even when everything broke. The only thing that stayed whole was human kindness. And I found it again. The day he didn't wake up. One still morning, Raymond didn't rise with the sun. The staff found him seated in his chair, the blanket still folded neatly across his knees. His fingers rested gently on the frame of Linda's photo. His face was serene. He had gone in his sleep, not in darkness, not in silence, but in peace, home at last. "I'm home now, Lynn, and this time, it's not in the shadows." The memorial. No guns, no ceremony, just truth. There was no televised tribute, no rifles were fired, no flags draped across marble steps. Instead, the Veterans Village courtyard was filled with over 200 people, friends, fellow soldiers, lawyers, students, and strangers who had once read his story. Judge Alcott stood at the podium, his voice trembling. "This man saved me once by carrying my broken body through fire, and again years later by reminding me what justice truly means. He taught us that justice isn't a courtroom verdict. It's the choice to remember someone's humanity long after everyone else has forgotten it." A second statue, humble but heavy with meaning. 1 month later, inside the Veterans Village Library, a bronze bust was unveiled. No title, no rank, no medals are listed, just a simple engraving. Raymond Ellis, the man who stayed even when the world left. The seeds he planted keep growing. A once homeless veteran now runs the library Raymond sat in every afternoon. A high school student inspired by his speech earned a full scholarship for an essay titled, "Not All Heroes Carry Shields. Some Just Carry Old Photos and Memories No One Else Wants." A new New York state law passed with bipartisan support mandates, manual reviews for all sudden veteran benefit terminations called the Ellis Amendment. And in Prospect Park, a final bench. Near the spot where Raymond once spent freezing nights under a bridge, a stone bench now stands. It bears one final inscription: "No one is truly lost. Sometimes all they need is someone patient enough to go find them." The quiet ending that echoed. Raymond never sought fame, never asked for applause, but he became something larger than all of it. A symbol of grace under abandonment, a voice for those who lost theirs, a reminder that even when everything is taken, dignity can still be reclaimed, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is simply come back from the edge and help others do the same.